You're listening to episode 58 of the Confident Rider podcast with Jane Pike. Hey peeps, how goes it out there? I've been having some really interesting conversations this week in Joyride that has really had me reflecting around the topic of self-care and what that really means. And the intersection of self-care and this concept of flooding, which is one that we might be more familiar with in terms of horse training or horsemanship. And then following on from that, or flowing on from that, how we are showing up for our horses, or how we bring all that to our horses. So I think when it comes to a lot of these discussions, when we're looking at situations or feelings or beliefs that are so prevalent that the majority of people harbour them in some way. For example, this belief that I'm not good enough, it seduces literally everyone into thinking that they are the only ones that feel that way. However, I'm in the privileged position of talking with so many people and riders, thousands at this point, I would say, that I've had conversations with. And there is not one of those people that doesn't feel that way in some shape or form. And if they have reconciled that, it's because they've done work around it, right? So it's not that the seed wasn't there to begin with. It's just that for whatever reason, they've involved themselves in the kind of stuff that brings it to the surface and they've met it eye to eye. So when that's the case, when it is beyond just a single individual's expression or even a handful of individuals' expression, then we need to start to think about how we're being informed on a wider level. And I think that so many conversations around beliefs, around self-care and how we're showing up miss paying attention to this collective or cultural piece. And so if so many of us are on the hamster wheel, if so many of us or all of us have this lingering idea or belief of not being enough, what is it culturally, or what is it in our wider society that's feeding that? How is it that we're all absorbing that information and having it manifest in the same yet slightly different ways in our own experience? The reason that I want to start with this is because I feel like it really informs the self-care discussion. A lot of the idea of around motivation or how to cultivate motivation, the idea of how to cultivate empowerment comes from a collective assertion that we are not enough as we are now. And that if we were to think we were enough, that this would somehow remove us from the impetus or desire to involve ourselves in self-improvement. Right? So all of our educational facilities are really based around this idea of getting better and being better and wanting to hit this future mark. Our goal setting strategies, for the most part, are taught this way, that we're looking to move towards a future target and that the space between where it is we are now and where it is we want to be is one that implies that this future place that we land at will be better. And so this perpetual comparison or comparative analysis between the idea of what something will bring us and a future point that we land at where we're better, quote unquote, than we are now, automatically predisposes us to this idea of not being enough in the position that we're in. And it's an unwinnable game, if you like. The way that I approach it now is not to try to actually master this circuit, because it's like I say, it's unwinnable. It's to create a whole new set of circumstances, to seek out something different and to actually realize that this mindset is part of a wider matrix, a wider system at play that we can choose to remove ourselves from, and where there'll be actively ongoing conversations that we have to have with ourselves and practices that we have to have with ourselves to continually find our own center and to operate from that place. Self-care then has become a little bit of a catchphrase of late, and that's a good thing in so many ways, because we're coming from a work ethos that's been very mechanized, that's been very industrialized, that's been very dehumanized to a large extent. And that same consciousness or emergence of consciousness from that place to recognize individual passions and desires, and to actually recognize us as people in our own right, as opposed to being part of this kind of like wider mechanistic system, is also happening in horsemanship. So we're moving away from horses as a commodity and towards horses as a partner. And within that understanding, we're learning more about behavior, we're learning more about nuance, we're understanding stress signals and tension and how our nervous systems function, and how our individual and collective histories are feeding into what it is that we find ourselves working with on a day-to-day basis. So it's really, really fascinating. So we're at this transition point, I guess is what I'm trying to say, this transition point, I believe, between just being part of this kind of wider machine to realizing we have choice about how we want to show up in the world, how we want to show up for our horses, how we want to be out there. But the essence or the residue of what it is that we've come from is still living in our bodies. And so we find ourselves at times feeling as though we're at war with ourselves, where we have this what might be intuitive sense of what we need, and yet the imprint of what we should be doing, what it means to be a good person, what it means to be a productive person, is overriding that in terms of our thoughts. And self-care very easily becomes part of that dynamic, in that we feel like taking care of ourselves is another box to tick. It's like a separate activity, like going to a yoga class or getting a massage, or, something that we might understand as like the magazine version of self-care, where if I actually say the word self-care, what springs to mind? Now, I actually don't believe it's like the massage or the specific time out for yourself, but that is what pops in. That's what's kind of informed my understanding of that idea unconsciously. So if I was to not think about it too much, that would be the initial impression that I get. Now, I'm not saying that those things aren't great or necessary or welcomed. This is not what that conversation's about. But I want to reframe this idea of self-care as being an extracurricular activity. And as a consequence of that, we can even feel guilty or like we're failing at self-care, because for many of us, I know I'll speak for myself, life is really full. And some of it's by design, but also I'm in the rush hour period of life in terms of I have young children, I have young horses, I have my own business. There are things that do require my attention that I can't just delegate or, cross off the list, because that has pretty extreme consequences. But if I then think, okay, gosh, I'm feeling depleted, I'm feeling tired, I'm feeling a little bit burnt out, however we might describe kind of hitting the lower ebb of our threshold. And then I think, I'm not doing anything to take care of myself. I'm still part of that cycle. I'm still part of that system that's telling me that the doing is the answer rather than the returning to myself. The idea then of self-care, or the one that I really subscribe to, is that ultimately self-care is being able to follow the own rhythm of your body wherever possible. And given that we are mammals, and we are part of this wider ecosystem of nature, an intrinsic part, and it is a part of us. Ultimately, if we were in flow with nature, in flow with our environment, this idea of self-care would be so obsolete, because it is a given that we would be caring for ourselves as part of following the natural urges and intentions of our body. Now, this doesn't mean that we become kind of raw and primal. It's just that we're in a rhythm, we're in a flow and in a harmony with nature, which means that we are co-regulating. You know, I am a part of this system that feeds back balance from myself, and I gain balance as a part of being part of that as well. Then to understand self-care as following the rhythm of my body, of understanding that there are limitations within that, just as part of being part of a modern society, in that I may go to work at very specific times and there's no flexibility in how that looks. Or, you know, my children are waking me up in the night because they're very little, and that's not something I can directly control. So there are obviously parameters around this that limit our ability to be completely organic in terms of how it is we might ultimately like to be, or what might represent the ultimate health of our body. However, for most of us are ignoring very obvious signals from our body. We're ignoring the fact that we need to go to the toilet, and we might register that and then not go for another hour because we're busy or we're tending to someone else. We might skip a meal or not notice that we're hungry or thirsty, you know, and these are very base needs of our body that are being ignored. And then we wonder, and I know we wonder this because I have a lot of conversations around this, how is it that we can get in touch with our intuition? How is it that we can pay attention to our gut signals? How is it that we can check in with ourselves and have more adaptable boundaries so that the intelligence of our body is saying yes in certain situations, no in certain situations, and we're in alignment enough with that understanding to follow it through? And I say, if you're not paying attention to the bigger signals of your body, it's an unrealistic expectation to think that you're going to pay attention to the more subtle references that it's bringing up, because you're out of attunement. You're not paying attention, yeah? And it's a disconnect, it's a disembodiment that we have been taught as well. So this is not about feeling bad or beating up on yourself. It's just recognizing that you have been trained to override your body as the lesser part of you and give preference to what it is that your mind is telling you. Now, this starts, I believe, from very young. So when we're at school, most of us have gone to a fairly traditional school setting in whatever way that, you know, that was apparent for you. Some of us not, but most of us have gone to school from a young age. And that can start from like 4 or 5, right? So you're in a school situation. You have lessons or classes that maybe go for an hour each. And within that, you're required to conform to the information. Meaning that if you feel like it's too much, if you feel like it's overwhelming, if you feel like you need to move around because you're a bit fidgety, if you feel tired or you feel actually active and you want to move, that's not permissible within that context, right? You have to be there for the duration of that lesson. And for the most part, there is a limited range in what it is you're able to express that your body might be telling you within that context. And that can even be, you can't go to the toilet till the end of the class. So we've been trained actually to habitually override the signals of our body in preference for what it is that's occurring in front of us. And so you can see how we get habitually removed from paying attention, or habitually removed from actually being able to follow through on the natural impulses of our body, because our cultural setup has trained us to behave that way. So that's one thing that I want to mention. And I think that this really feeds into our horses, because ultimately, to me, when you get to a level of horsemanship that I aspire to, it's an artistic expression. It's a alchemy of the both of you, of your horse and yourself. And the integration is one where you know clearly who and where you stand as individual parts of the equation. But you also, and as a consequence of that, you're able to integrate in a very conscious and effective way. Now, you being a part of the equation where you do have a clear sense of yourself, where you do have a clear sense of your boundaries and your backbone and your center, means that you are, for the most part, in tune with what it is your body is telling you. You're responsive to your environment. And responsiveness is really where it is we want to get to. Responsiveness is us being able to say, actually, I need to remove myself from this situation, or this is too much, or this is where, I want to go further in this. It's not about fitting into the environment. It's not about shape-shifting to meet someone else's demands or expectations. It's you actually being able to say no. It's you actually being able to recognize that something might be too much, and so on and so forth. So it's actually recognizing your threshold as the reality of the moment, regardless of what you would like it to be. Yeah, it's honoring that in the moment and then doing whatever you need to do to be able to soften the edges of any resistance you feel and expand your capacity from that place. But it's not a forced job. It's not a forced job. A lot of the work that I do in Joyride is surprisingly deep stuff. And what I mean by surprisingly deep is that it really drops you into yourself on a nervous system level. And at the beginning of the program, I really take pains to specify that it is a body-led approach, meaning that we are working in connection with what it is our body is telling us rather than what it is that our mind is telling us. And what happens is that we understand that, right? And we think that we're honoring that. But a few instances have come up that of late, and this is just why it's popped into my mind, but this is coming up all the time, where actually we aren't in tune with what it is that our body is telling us, and we're pushing through even when we don't realize we're pushing through. So we're ignoring the subtle messages of our body that are telling us that we're probably reaching capacity, that the work that we're doing is taking us towards threshold, and that we need to take a break or do something to restore a little bit of settling in the system, to resource ourselves to get back inside our window of tolerance or our window of dignity. And we don't realize that we've gone to that place until we've gone to that place and we're like, wow, why do I feel this way? Why do I feel anxious? Why do I feel so tired? Why do I feel so on and so forth? And so this idea of it being a body-led approach is something that applies to all of life that we've become habitually disconnected from, in that we have lost the ability to tune into these subtle signals of our body that tell us that we're getting towards threshold. And the reason that this is comes up in Joyride is that the material actually drops you into your body. It drops you into your nervous system. And the tripwire, I guess, that we can fall into is because some of the movement-based exercises or some of the awareness-based exercises seem so non-exertive, we give ourselves this idea that we can kind of burn through it. But what's happening is happening on a level that is below our conscious awareness, and it can affect us in ways that really catch us by surprise. So that if we have been operating in a level of what I would say is normalized high functional freeze, in that you're going around in a state of kind of high tonicity or awareness in your body, you're constantly looking out for things that could go wrong, you've got this almost chronic state of hypervigilance about you. When you start to soften the edges of that, everything, all of the stored survival stress that has been underneath gets liberated. And so it's really important that we do this work in a really slow and measured way so that the amount of integration that is happening is something that you're able to hold, that it doesn't get bigger than your body, that you're actually growing in capacity in response to the work that we're doing as opposed to overwhelming yourself. And depending on what your default tendency has been, depending on where your nervous system has chosen to take you in order to keep you safe in the situations that have led you up until this point, we all have a default mode. And for some of us, that is collapse. It's like a sense of despondency. It's a checking out. And I call it being an astronaut in your own body, where you're kind of hovering above the surface. You can get things done. You're in life. For the most part, people might think you're fine. But as soon as you really jump back in and get in touch with yourself, things start coming up. So the work that I'm doing is affected by this conversation of self-care. Everyone is affected by this conversation of self-care, especially now, because now we're in a situation where our world climate is very volatile and there are a lot of things going on which feel very out of control and can be incredibly destabilizing. So regardless of where it is we're sitting currently in our nervous system, all of us are sitting higher than usual. All of us are sitting in a place of high activation or higher activation for the most part, just given what it is that's going on. Now, flooding, if we think about what flooding means in horsemanship terms, flooding is when you introduce a stimulus to your horse and you keep it there until they have no response or reaction. So there's no removal and adding of pressure and release. There's no positive reinforcement. There's no kind of titration or drip feeding in of the stimulus until the horse has actually regulated itself, found a good place to be with that and actually understands and has been able to assimilate the information. Instead, you kind of go until actually what usually happens is that the state of acceptance, which is it's interpreted at, is actually a state of shutdown. And we are flooding our systems all of the time in a similar way because we're not having this nuanced awareness of our own stress signals or our own stress indicators and the thresholds that we get to. So the work that I do with my horses and the people that I've learned from has been very informed by this idea of stress signals or stress indicators, and simultaneously relaxation indicators. But you can see that if you approach a horse that's unfamiliar to you, that you don't have a level of intimacy with, for instance, or there's something going on with a horse that you do, that you're able to read the earlier signs of stress that can allow you to introduce new elements of understanding, new elements of pressure or perceived pressure in a way that they're able to assimilate and integrate without overwhelming them. Which means it might be a slightly different shape of the eye. It might be a wrinkling of the nose. It might be a movement of the body in quite a subtle way that kind of leans away from you. That's telling you, actually, I'm registering this as a lot. And if you were to continue to apply the pressure, that's either going to send me right over threshold or I'm going to go into shutdown in some way. So you titrate, you pendulate, you swing between backing off, waiting for the system to settle, and then introducing the stimulus again in a way that's manageable. But the key to it is knowing when to stop. And if we were to keep going, that would be flooding. Now, the news is an example that I want to bring up now because I've seen this in my own work, I've seen this in my own life, and I think it's particularly prevalent now in that we can turn on or log into a news site, turn on the news on the television or the radio, and then we're also on Facebook, which is like or Instagram not so much, but Facebook definitely is a kind of cacophony of information coming at you. And for the most part, the whole purpose of the news is to be negatively geared. There's a negative bias towards what the news represents and presents. So we're hearing about the coronavirus, we're hearing about politics, we're hearing about, crime rates, we're hearing generally bad news. And what I see is this idea that to be informed means that and to be a good person who's actually showing up in the world in a conscientious way, that we need to be constantly on top of what it is that's happening. But what I also see is people really not respecting what it is their body is telling them, taking themselves way over threshold and flooding their system with all of this bad news and information, and just not being able to sustain it. And that's showing up in other areas of their life, such as feeling overwhelmed for the entire course of the day, feeling like they're snapping at people, getting on to ride and feeling way more anxious than they've ever identified with previously. And it's because we've already taken ourselves into this state of hypervigilance. Our system hasn't been able to tolerate the amount of information coming at it. And so the flow-on effect of that shows up in every other area of our lives. So be really aware of where it is you are flooding your system right now. And if you're having very real messages from your body of fatigue, of feeling wired, of feeling overwhelmed, and notice where it is you could actually limit what it is that's coming in, the incoming stimulus, the incoming information, so that you can let yourself settle and do something to regulate, do something to restore, do something to nurture. Being a conscientious member of the world, being someone who is informed, is not the same as drowning yourself in the news. Yeah, it's not the same as needing to say yes to everything. And I think sometimes even we can confuse being overly empathetic with actual stress responses. I think we do that. We can confuse empathy with a stress response. And so the flow-on effect of this happens in so many different areas, and the news might not be your thing, like you might not watch it, but we have different situations in life where we actually have this conscious fixed rule about what it means to be a good person or a good this, that, and the other. And we are engaging in activities where our body is actually saying enough. And then we might feel really tired or so on and so forth. But if you can just tune into those subtle signals before you get to that point, the feeling in your stomach, the desire to look away from the screen, the distraction, the feeling like you just need to get up and move around, all of that is an indication that you're reaching your capacity. Now, the key is really being able to stay with yourself in the midst of that experience, to not abandon yourself. And so just become aware of how you're responding to those things and stay with it. Honor what's presenting, so switch it off, move away. But just recognize what you need to do to keep yourself well and to take care of yourself. And to me, to loop it back around to how we started this conversation, that is self-care. That is recognizing I am at the edge of my threshold right now or nearing it. And if I don't do something to actually resource myself or to pace myself, then this is going to show up in ways that feel outside my control and ensure the type of presence that I actually am wanting to be, which is a sustainable and reliable one, is just not available to me anymore. So these intersections all feed into our riding and our partnerships with our horses, because we carry with us and we bring to them the place that we're at. And if that place is overwhelmed, if it's unresourced, if we've flooded ourselves over the course of the day, we can't help but carry that fractured energy with us to the horse, to our horses, to the stable, to the barn, to the paddock, wherever it is. The work of being empowered, the work of being resilient, is not about conforming or increasing your capacity to be able to fit in with the world or take more of the world in. It's actually sensitizing yourself to the true signals of your body that are telling you where it is you are at right now. And just with your horse, just as with horse training, it takes the time that it takes. The work of increasing your capacity takes the time that it takes. It can't be forced. You can't force relaxation. You can't force your capacity to hold more activation or experience. You can't force yourself to do these things as much as we would like to. And actually trying to will send you into a mode that's pretty debilitated. So start to tune in. The invitation is start to tune in, get curious how you feel, be mindful of your introspective world or your internal world as you're engaging in activities. And notice when you start to show those signals of like, I think I've had enough. Like, I think the cup's kind of filling up right now and I could do with some space from this activity, or it's something different to kind of bring me back to myself. Play with it. It's essential. It's essential for happy and healthy partnerships with our horses. And let me know how you get on, because I'm always so keen to hear how you have played with some of these concepts. So if you want to get in touch, you can find me on Facebook and Instagram, confident_rider on Instagram, The Confident Rider on Facebook. And of course, confidentwriter.online is the place to go to if you want to flick me a message. Joyride is my membership program where we're doing all of this incredible work, and there is an incredible community of riders right there adventuring along with you. So if you want to check that out, you can do so on my website as well, confidentwriter.online/joyride. Have a fabulous rest of your day. Excited to hear how you get on, and I will catch you all in the next episode.